This is the story of a woman who fought injustice. In 1813, when Prudence Crandall was 10 years old, her family moved from Hopkinton, Rhode Island, to a farm outside the prosperous community of Canterbury, Connecticut. Prudence loved farm life. She, her two brothers, and her little sister did chores and played along the Quinebaug River. Aided by her Quaker upbringing, Prudence never lost the Crandall stubbornness. She questioned everything.
The progenitor of the Crandall clan was a man named Elder John Crandall, who got kicked out of Massachusetts, which I think is some kind of badge of honor back when Massachusetts was ruled by the Puritans.
So clearly there was a tradition of dissent within the family.
Legend has it that Prudence tells us,
"My father was talking with a neighbor about business, and he ordered me back to the house. I told him, my brother Hezekiah doesn't have to leave. Why should I? My mother said it's important for a man to learn about business, but not me, because I am a girl. It didn't make any sense. It still doesn't. My whole life has been one of opposition."
After graduation from a Quaker school in Rhode Island, Prudence came back to Connecticut and taught in local schools. She was then asked to establish a private school to provide higher education for young women in Canterbury. She agreed. And in 1831, with the support of her community, the 28-year-old teacher paid $500 in cash and was given a $1,500 loan to buy one of Canterbury's finest houses on the town green.
She had a secure background. Her family was well known in that town. They were secure. They were related to some of the leading people.
Her next-door neighbor, Andrew T. Judson, was an attorney, a state legislator, and the most influential man in Canterbury. Realizing that the school would attract the daughters of the most prominent families, Judson quickly joined the school's board of visitors. The school was a success, and by the end of 1832, Mr. Judson and his board reported, "This school has given entire satisfaction." Prudence and her school were thriving, so a shocking event that had occurred in Virginia the year before would not seem to have any connection to this idyllic life. In 1831, in a bloody slave rebellion, Nat Turner and his followers had killed 54 white men, women, and children. His inspiration, he claimed, had come from reading the Bible.
And the easy argument that is made that if you educate this group of people, you will have political turmoil. And therefore, in order to keep the peace that is not really there, but is imagined and mythologized, you are justified in keeping a particular segment of the population in intellectual darkness.
At the same time, Prudence's free black housekeeper, Maria Davis, introduced Prudence to The Liberator, a new abolitionist newspaper dedicated to an immediate end to slavery.
What I think has happened is that Maria Davis is taking the measure of Prudence Crandall and has figured out this woman is someone who might be willing to stand with us.
Among the paper's contributors was Maria Stewart, an eloquent African-American woman who insisted that racial equality had to include women's equality and education. These words went straight to Prudence's heart. In 1784, Connecticut was the first state to commit to gradual emancipation. But freedom from slavery did not mean social equality. William Harris was a prosperous free black farmer active in the abolitionist movement. His son Charles was engaged to Prudence's housekeeper, Maria Davis, who had been permitted to sit in on some of Prudence's classes. And then, in the fall of 1832, 19-year-old Sarah Harris, a close friend of Maria Davis, asks Prudence if she could enroll in her school. As Sarah put it, to get a little more learning, if possible, enough to teach colored children. and if you admit me to your school, I shall forever be under the greatest obligation to you. But if you think it will be the means of injuring you, I will not insist on the favor. Sarah Harris dreamed of becoming a teacher, but she was well aware of what could happen to Crandall School if she were admitted. Prudence took several days to make her decision. She knew that if she admitted Sarah, she could lose her school and everything she had worked for. But Prudence believed that slavery was a sin, and so was keeping Sarah from the knowledge that could make her truly free. Sarah became a day school student.
The idea that everyone needed a basic level of literacy was a given. But higher education implies social equality. And the high school that Prudence Crandall had opened, first for the white women in 1831, was the highest level of education available.
Prudence is visited by a delegation of irate matrons. If you do not send this girl away, they demand, we will withdraw our daughters and your school will fail. Prudence calmly replies,
It might sink then, for I should not turn her out.
In an unusual move for a woman of that era, Prudence travels alone to Boston to meet William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist and publisher of The Liberator, to ask him if it would be possible to start a school for young black women.
I made up my mind that if it were possible, I would teach colored girls exclusively.
25-year-old William Lloyd Garrison, hated by many in the North and South, was described as a crazy fanatic. His fledgling newspaper, The Liberator, was being kept afloat almost entirely by African-American subscribers.
Here is someone who is a champion of immediate abolition, who says, don't caution me, don't invite me to be modest, don't expect me to be demure. If a house is on fire, I have to put it out. And for Garrison, all people deserved rights, women and men.
In the South, there was a reward for Garrison's capture, dead or alive, and the Liberator was blamed for causing the bloody Nat Turner revolt. This was the man Prudence went to for advice.
So Garrison gave her letters of introduction to black ministers and black community leaders in Providence and in New York City.
She was very, very stubborn. She didn't compromise, never thought of compromising. And in this way, this is one of the reasons that she and William Lloyd Garrison worked so well together. It was just at the beginning of his career. He never compromised. He never negotiated. He never backed down. In fact, he did exactly what she did. He was always upping the ante.
With a list of black preachers and their parishioners, Prudence begins a daring campaign to recruit African-American students.
They seem to feel much for the education of their daughters.
I think it was an extraordinary act of courage on the part of the parents of these African-American girls to entrust their daughters, their precious children, to a strange woman, a strange white woman.
They wanted their daughters to get an education, and they wanted their daughters to get a good education. And so they were willing to trust Crandall, which shows that she must have made quite an impression.
Prudence is visited by the most influential men of the village. If black students were all placed upon an equal footing, they insisted, property and life would no longer be safe. And besides, they warned her, this will lead to intermarriage. Instead of bursting into tears, as the men had expected, Prudence replies,
Moses had a black wife.
The infuriated men stalked out. An advertisement placed in the Liberator announced that on April 1st, 1833, the school would reopen for the purpose of educating young ladies and little misses of color.
15 men signed the ad for Crandall School. Of those 15 men, 8 were black and 7 were white. So the document endorsing Crandall School is really unique. This is a phenomenal document, which, at least in my experience, is unequaled in the entire annals of abolition from the 1830s on to the Civil War. for its equality of representation of black and white.
Our sons and daughters will be ruined if this school continues, thunders Andrew T. Judson at an emergency town meeting held in the Congregational Church. In 19th century America, women were not allowed to speak in public, so Prudence had to ask her friends, Reverend Samuel May and Arnold Buffum, to speak for her. As the men tried to address the excited crowd, they were shouted down and threatened with violence. By using a pauper law from 1650, Prudence's black students could be designated vagrants.
They threatened, we'll fine you again, we'll fine you again. And multiply that by your 20 students, you'll be penniless. And she knew this.
On April 12, 1833, the first out-of-state student arrived by stagecoach from Providence, Rhode Island. It was 17-year-old Anne Eliza Hammond. A day after her arrival, the authorities threatened Prudence with heavy fines, and if the fines were not paid, Anne Eliza could be whipped publicly. Anne Eliza replies that she would gladly put up with a whipping if it meant she could get an education.
How extraordinary that one would be willing to risk being whipped publicly, half naked, in order to go to school. African Americans, an education at this time was like giving them a magic wand. I mean, kids now sometimes don't want to go to school. They don't see what school will do for them. But those children saw all too clearly that going to school was the passport to a whole new world.
In the end, the pauper law didn't work because several wealthy friends of Prudence promised to pay the town up to $10,000 in fines. Prudence was delighted when Sarah Harris, her first African-American student, returned to the school.
In the midst of this affliction, I am as happy as at any moment in my life.
So I think it's important to understand the integrity of Crandall's intentions and the integrity and bravery of those students who were ready to come into the town of Canterbury that did not want them there.
One prospective student, after enduring a string of insults on her long stagecoach trip, arrived in Brooklyn, Connecticut. Since no one was willing to drive her to Canterbury, she hoisted her baggage on her shoulder and walked the 6 miles to the school.
I think this story has been miscast as a story about noble white women teaching the oppressed to read. But it is not that. It is a white woman trying to help black women to achieve the intellectual equality that will enable them to achieve social equality. None of her students were people who had just escaped from slavery. Her students came from the very small, free black middle class.
More students arrived from hundreds of miles away, from New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. When most Canterbury shopkeepers refused to sell them food, Prudence's father and brother hauled provisions to the school. Gangs of boys followed the girls everywhere, blowing tin horns and shouting insults. Judson lobbied for a new state law that would close down the school and run Prudence out of Canterbury. These pupils congregate here, he said, under the pretense of educating them, but really to scatter firebrands, arrows, and death among brethren of our own blood.
The white men of Canterbury did not want black women to be tempting their sons. One of the arguments against the school was that it was going to lead to interracial marriage. And one of the students did remark, I don't think I'd want to be with any of these men after the way they were treated in the villages.
Prudence's father petitioned the Connecticut legislators. I entreat the members of this assembly to remember those self-evident truths, that all mankind are created free and equal, whether they are white or black. Judson was successful, and the passage of the Black Law, as it came to be known, was loudly celebrated on the town green. The Black Law made it a crime for any African American to enter Connecticut from another state for the purpose of attaining an education. The large fines, Judson hoped, would bankrupt the school.
I was just rereading the full text yesterday of the Black Law, and it is truly to the eternal disgrace of Connecticut to have tried to limit people for purposes of education. But if you read the law carefully, it is quite clear that what they fear is social equality.
On June 27, 1833, Prudence was served with a warrant for the crime of teaching colored persons who did not live in Connecticut. Under arrest, the deputy sheriff drove her to the county jail in Brooklyn, Connecticut. Her trial would take place in August, but Judson and the other men were certain that she would never actually go to jail. Surely someone would pay her $150 bail. It would be embarrassing for them if they were seen as bullies locking up a respectable young woman for teaching children.
I am only afraid they will not put me in jail.
This was exactly what Prudence had planned for. Prudence did spend the night in jail, accompanied by her friend Anna Benson. The next afternoon at 4 o'clock, the two ladies were released. Anna's father, George Benson, paid the bail as planned.
People all across the nation who were reading about this were horrified that these civilized gentlemen would put a woman of her background and education in the common jail.
But the harassment did not stop. A rock was thrown through the front window. Prudence set it in a place of honor on the mantel, as if it were a trophy. While Prudence awaits the trial, the 17 pupils in Miss Crandall's school continue with their classes. They are described by one visitor as having better claims to grace and beauty than the majority of belles and matrons of the district. When the trial began, the prosecuting attorney, Andrew Judson, argued that the black law was justified because African Americans were not citizens and therefore they had no rights. Prudence's attorney, William Ellsworth, replied, "All black people are citizens. They were born in America. They fought for freedom in the American Revolution. And there is nothing in the Constitution that says they are not full-fledged citizens. The black law is unconstitutional, and breaking it is no crime." The jury couldn't agree on a verdict. Her case needed to be retried, and Prudence's guilt or innocence would once again depend upon whether white Americans believed that African Americans were citizens. The harassment against the school continued. It was discovered that someone had polluted the school's well, and the girls were denied clean water by all of their neighbors. Undaunted, Prudence's father hauled barrels of water to the school from his farm.
She just didn't know how to give up. She just didn't. And the abolitionists were like that. And the suffragettes, too. They would go decade after decade after decade, defeat after defeat after defeat, and they just didn't stop.
In an English class, one of her pupils wrote, "Miss Crandall reminded us to not return evil for evil." On October 3, 1833, the second trial found Prudence guilty, and Prudence's lawyers filed an appeal asking the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors to review the case. Prudence and her students were not defeated yet. At the school, the girls sat around the fireplace.
"Love and union seem to bind our little circle in bonds of sisterly affection," wrote one of the girls.
And in November there was more happiness. With the whole school invited, Sarah Harris married George Fairweather. Also, the Reverend Calvin Filio came calling on their beloved teacher. He was a widower with 2 young children. Was this a new romance? These speculations were interrupted when on January 28, 1834, a student smelled smoke in one of the rooms. Frederick Olney, an African-American who was the handyman for the school, grabbed an axe and began chopping out a part of the exterior wall, revealing a roaring fire. Realizing that the fire could also spread to their homes, several townspeople came to Olney's assistance, and the flames were extinguished. Prudence was shaken. The fire had been deliberately set.
But all of a sudden, when somebody sets a fire in your house and they're trying to burn down the house over the heads of you and some 20 young women, that's serious.
But Prudence and her pupils decided they would continue with their school. Letters of encouragement began arriving from all over the world, and because of voter disapproval, Andrew Judson lost his re-election in the Connecticut legislature. There was also other news. Race riots had broken out in Philadelphia and New York City.
Race riots like this were not uncommon in the 1830s. They broke out all up and down the East Coast, and there were terrible riots. I mean, homes of African Americans were burned, people were beaten up on the street, people were lynched. It was a horrible time.
On July 28, 1834, the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors heard Prudence's case and ruled Prudence not guilty due to a tiny technical mistake in the arrest warrant. Prudence had won, but the civil rights of African Americans were still precarious, and the black law had not been struck down. On August 12, 1834, Prudence and Reverend Calvin Filio were married.
They were not happy. It would seem he was not the most pleasant man in the world, and at certain points, really later in his life, completely unhinged. Why would she marry someone like that? I think she was very frightened at that time. She felt very, very vulnerable.
She wrote a poem once that said something, I wish I had a lover, I'm longing to be loved. And I think she was a woman, she wanted to be loved.
After their honeymoon, Prudence returned to Canterbury with her new family. She was no longer in danger of going to prison. She loved her stepchildren, her students, and her work. The future looked promising. On September 9th, 1834, an angry mob attacked the school. This became the final act of enraged men who had been beaten by a stubborn teacher and 20 young female students. My heart glowed with indignation. I felt ashamed of Canterbury, ashamed of Connecticut, ashamed of my country, ashamed of my color, wrote Reverend Samuel May after viewing the wreckage. Reluctantly, the girls were told that the school would have to be closed. They loved their teacher, and despite the harassment, one student described the school as a place of communion with heaven. They sadly packed their belongings. Prudence and her family moved away from Canterbury, first to upstate New York, then Mendota, Illinois, and finally to a farm in Elk Falls, Kansas. In 1838, the black law was struck down. In 1868, Connecticut was the first state to ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, making it clear that African Americans were indeed full citizens. The same defense Prudence invoked when she broke the black law.
The school is sometimes presented as a failure because it only lasted for 17 months, April of 1833 to September of 1834. I take issue with this idea that the school was a failure. I think the school was a resounding success. Anytime you could keep a school open for 17 months, when every day you are subjected to vigilante violence, when a law is passed against you by the assembly of your state, when all of the elected officials of your town and all of the law enforcement officials of your town are on official record disapproving of your presence, and you manage to keep that school open 17 months, that's an achievement.
In 1886, Canterbury and the state of Connecticut made an official apology to Prudence and voted her an annuity of $400 a year.
Philip Pearl, who was one of the people who had had a great deal to do with writing the infamous Black Law, said it was one of the worst things he'd ever did. How could he have done that? He says something about he wished he could have shed tears of blood because he wished he had never done that.
Mark Twain proposed that he would like to buy the house back and give it to her. And she said, "Oh, no, thank you. Home is where the heart is, and I think I'd like to stay here, but could I have some of your books and a photograph?" So he sent those along. But she did get a formal, written, public apology from the state of Connecticut.
She starts as someone who's not able to turn away someone who wants to learn. Her first student is not a professed abolitionist. She's someone who wants to learn a little more so she can teach, so that she can bring others into a world of light and learning and enable and empower them. And it has everything to do with creating a just society. It's not a political move, but education is inherently political, because that's the most, for some, the most emancipatory tool of them all. You can break the shackle, but if you know not where you're going, what's the point? But you break the shackle and you can write the manifesto. You know, what can stand in your way?
Almost 50 years after Sarah Harris Fairweather asked Prudence to help her get a little more learning, the young woman who started it all made the long journey to Kansas to visit her old teacher. Within a year of their joyful reunion, Sarah died at the age of 67.
Prudence Crandall lived 87 years, fighting to the end of her life for the equality of both women and African Americans.